Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Marina Garde, Assistant Director at Espacio de Culturas here at NYU. And on behalf of the entire team, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the second day of our symposium, Contesting Indigeneity, Connecting Peoples, organized by this semester's Andrés Bello Chair in Latin American Cultures and Civilizations, Professor Enrique Okenve. Professor Okenve's introductory lecture in February, Indigenizing in the Spanish Empire and African Perspective, together with yesterday's presentations, has opened up a set of questions about how indigeneity has been shaped, contested, and redefined across the Spanish Empire. Today, Professor Okenve will be building on that foundation through a roundtable conversation with our speakers in dialogue with all of you. But if you didn't join us yesterday, that's okay, don't worry. This session pretty much stands on its own. What we hope to create this afternoon is a space for exchange, bringing together perspectives to reflect on how indigenous peoples on how indigenous responses to colonial power have shaped societies and identities across time and geography. We want to thank our colleagues from across NYU who have helped us bring Professor Okenve to campus, including the chair of the History Department, Guy Artelano, Professors Robin Davignon and Leo Douglas, and Benita San Pedro from Hofstra. Thank you all for being here and for contributing to this discussion. And now I would like to invite Professor Okenve to guide us through today's roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you everybody here at Espacio de Culturas for once again making this possible. Today, we are going to do things a little bit different from yesterday. It's going to be less formal, equally informative. I hope, right? So that's the spirit for today. And just very briefly, let me tell you, for those who are not here, Contesting Indigeneity, Connecting Peoples. Yesterday we have the day one session, which was about contestations at the ground level. And the idea was that to zero in the different experiences of the of indigenous communities, peoples, across different parts of this Spanish Empire, but the Spanish Empire not as the space just that created by the Spanish or the Iberians, but also as the space that was also recreated by the indigenous peoples across different areas of this world and throughout time. I think that's another thing that is very interesting for us, because these colonial experiences in some cases were simultaneous, in other cases they were not. And yet there were connections. One of the things that I spoke about in my lecture is how, in the case of Equatorial Guinea, there were continued references to the experiences of the Philippines and the Americas when organizing the colonial project in Equatorial Guinea, which is fundamentally a late 19th, from the late 19th century into the second half of the 1968, of the 20th century. So it's very interesting to see and examine these connections of contestation and so on and so forth. Today, I want us to focus a little bit more on these connections. And we're going to do it by way of different questions. But before addressing these questions and getting you involved in the discussion, I would like to ask everyone to introduce yourselves, so we can then start the session.
Thank you, Enrique. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, I also would like to echo the invitation to be here. I'm an archaeologist. Well, first of all, I'm Steven Acabado. Acabado comes first. It's always a joke. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a professor of anthropology at UCLA. I'm also the chair of the archaeology interdepartmental program and director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I'm not an historian, but my work in the last 15 years tries to bridge this seeming arbitrary difference between history and archaeology. We ask similar questions, but we approach it differently. So we're trying to come up with, at least in the Philippine context and Southeast Asian context broadly, a framework where we work with historians, environmental historians, even like paleoclimatologists, in understanding the last 500 years of Southeast Asian history.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for having me. I'm Dana or Lana, doesn't matter. It's been either since I've been 2 years old. Velasco Murillo, and I'm a historian at UC San Diego. I'm an associate professor, and I'm basically describe myself as an ethno and social historian. And in particular, I work on the northern Mexican mining district, which was often cast for hundreds of years as a just Spanish male entrepreneurial space. So I'm trying to expand the footprint of the mining district. And again, it's very nice to be here. I appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. I want to say thank you again for the invitation to stay here. My name is Jorge Ulloa, and I am a mix of archaeology and history because my bachelor was in history, and after that, I entered in the wave of archaeology. My focus is basically right now is in archaeology and material cultures in different perspective. My current occupation is like a professor in the University of Miami in Florida, but before I was working in the Caribbean, basically in Cuba and Dominican Republic. And also I was involved in an important project in Holland in the past for next to 1492 encounter of the Caribbean with the globalizing work.
Hello, everyone. My name is Omar Badisi. I am an assistant visiting professor at Vassar College, and I research Hispano-Moroccan relationship from perspectives that are medical, cultural, and also historical.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Rebecca Getz. I'm an associate professor of history here at NYU. And I believe that Enrique asked me to join us because I am currently finishing a book about enslaved Native people in the Greater Caribbean from the late 15th to the late 18th century. Some of my remarks yesterday were about how important it is for archaeologists and historians to talk to one another when we're talking about the long history of Spanish imperialism around the globe.
All right, thank you, everyone. I have prepared like a few questions, and I think we still can use those questions. But I think based on where our discussion ended yesterday, or temporarily ended yesterday, I think we can take it from there. We were discussing this notion of indigeneity. What does it mean? What does it mean at different stages, and also what does it mean depending on who is defining this concept? And one of the things that I was thinking as you guys were talking about it, I was thinking about the situation in Equatorial Guinea, where under colonialism, the different African people, African groups in Equatorial Guinea is a very small country created, of course, by way of colonization and the establishment of colonial borders. And we have at least seven different ethnic groups in Equatorial Guinea, and all of them were labeled as indigenous, as like the natives, basically, and they have, as a result of that, they have different legal status. Obviously, this was completely new, foreign and strange to the peoples of Equatorial Guinea, but very, very quickly they came to understand what it meant, because this categorization really affected their lives. They had a different legal status. They were not. Basically they were like children under the guardianship of what they call the Patronato de Indigenas, which was like trustship for the natives or something like that, and their rights were very, very limited. But from the 1930s, maybe even from the 20s, but especially from the 1930s, on the mainland in particular, which was colonized very late, around 1915. But from the early 1930s, you start seeing actions in which, like, we see how the different African groups realize that there is something that they share in common, and this is this notion of being indigenous. But this concept of indigenous stopped being important after independence. Equatorial Guinea there was not really, except for the island of Bioko, Fernando Po at the time, there was not really like white settlers. And so when the Spanish left in 1968, 1969, basically the population that remained in the country was just fundamentally Equatorial Guinean people. A few Nigerians, or a few thousand Nigerians, who later on left in the mid 1970s for other reasons. So because of that, indigeneity didn't really carry any weight afterwards. And at the same time, there is a notion, because I was wondering, or I was thinking about it, because in a sense, what perhaps is missing in what we were discussing yesterday from my perspective is, what is it, how indigenous peoples define themselves, what it means to be indigenous, right? And I realize in the case of Equatorial Guinea, particularly in the case of the Fang, who are the majority of the population in Equatorial Guinea, despite colonialism, despite being part now of a modern nation state and so on, they're still defining indigeneity according to our socio-political tradition. So somebody like me, born and raised in Spain, the son of a Spanish woman, my identity as a Fang person was never questioned. Of course, you are the son of Mvorzan, so that's my father. And Mvorzan is the son of Enrique Okenve, my grandfather. And as a result of that, basically, you belong. You are one of us. And I realized that that's not just something that happens as you visit your family village, but that's something that the Fang people who are in power, in a way, also, that is the same type of approach that they take. Right. So that is one example in which we see how they are defining indigeneity according to their own terms, despite the numerous transformations that took place. The notions are still very much like in one way or another local notions, as opposed to the imposed notions created through colonialism and so on. So I would like you, I would like you guys to maybe to speak a little bit about it, as if to see the extent to which indigenous people's notions can be incorporated or can be foregrounded in terms of like how we define who is indigenous, who is not, what does it mean to be indigenous, and so forth. And it's not just because you're closer to me, but because your paper was getting to terms, I think, with this more closely. I would like you to start, and then everybody else can just jump in. Stephen.
Thank you. I was hoping someone will jumpstart the conversation, but I guess I'll do it. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm Filipino. I work in Ifugao, consider in the Ifugao region. So the Ifugaos are the Ifugao. The term itself refers to a language and a group of people, and also uh, a province. But I'm from Bicol. I'm not Ifugao. So there is also that tension, because uh, I tend to, well, they tend to always talk to me as someone who capitulated to the Spanish aims in the Philippines, because their identity is that they weren't colonized. And so, as an archaeologist, one of my goals initially is to provide a date for the terraces, which most Filipinos think are 2,000 years old. They're only 300, maybe 400 years old. And so that impinges on their identity. And so just that one strand, within a generation, the identity of a community would change. And so as I mentioned yesterday, our basic education curriculum follows that of the United States in the late 1800s, where everyone has to become an American, and the Filipinos in 1946 adapted that for everyone to be Filipinos, negating the 180 or so indigenous groups. Going back to the question of indigeneity, in the Philippines, we don't have a settler colonial issue. Of course, in Mindanao, that's a different case. But within the country itself, the identity is shaped by how we teach kids, the curriculum, on the differences among different groups. And that's basically based on what the Spanish era scholars proposed on the peopling of the Philippines, where you have the waves of migration from the Negritos, Indonesians, and the Malays based on color of the skin and cultural sophistication. And for the longest time, that, well, almost up until 3 years ago, that's the model for the peopling of the Philippines. And then it's replicated again, replaced by the Austronesian hypothesis, which is again a colonial model replaced by another colonial model. So in essence, the foundation of indigeneity and ethno-linguistic identities in the Philippines is based on that waves of migration theory. It's a divide and conquer uh, uh, strategy by the Spanish, which again got replicated by the modern state. Um, and so to address that, looking at the archaeological record, at least in Ifugao and in Luzon, there's really no difference. The archaeological record shows that from the north to the south, there are subtle differences, but within specific regions, they share the same cosmology. So there's really no drastic difference. It was only after lowlanders became Christianized that that has become the basis of these differences.
Yeah, I would like to hear what everyone else has to say about this, because it seems that this colonial experience is pretty much what it's in many ways shaping the understanding of who is indigenous, who isn't, and what it means to be, and so on. I don't know who wants to take it on from here.
Yeah, I'll say a few things. Yeah, I think it's really, you bring up a really interesting point about on one level, there's the legal category of, being indigenous, and that is a viable legal category. And I think it's really interesting in all of your talks to kind of have seen how this is just an institution that just lasts and is just basically moved from one place to other. So like in Spanish America, there would have been a protector de indios, right? There was an actual Indian court, right? So there were all these legal apparatus for that. I think that my own work was really struggling to kind of figure out what's going on, because my first book went the entire colonial period from the 1540s to the 1800s. And initially, basically, the scholarship was like, there are no native peoples in the mining district because they went to a mining town. And so they all became acculturated and they Hispanized. That was the word, acculturated, Hispanized. And I think going back to what you said yesterday, what I saw in my research was I saw something entirely different. I saw these ethnogenetic processes. And so I think that ethnogenesis, right, is really so important. And it's just another way of saying that identity and ethnicity is very dynamic. And so, and I think it is, especially for the early modern period, like the early modern people were extremely local. And I think for them, they kind of defined their identity, and these native people saw themselves very much as indigenous, and it didn't matter that they were living among Spaniards, and it didn't matter that they married people of Afro descent. If you identified as indigenous, and one of the things that I saw in going back to your presentation was it was defined through practice, right? They spoke native languages, they went to indigenous parishes, right? Right, they continued to marry in native peoples. There was all these markers of indigenous identity. So I think, right, it is this kind of tension between how maybe the state wants to categorize people, or how even people want to perceive other people. So like people really resist the notion that anyone who's not living in a discrete indigenous community is still indigenous. And like it's just amazing to see this, right? But I think at the core, people are still very, very local, and it's really how they define themselves. So I think for me, a discussion of indigeneity is not really a discussion anymore about like, were they acculturated, were they Hispanized? It's like, what were the dynamic processes that shape them, but that they still maintain their indigenous identity. But of course, they're going to change and evolve. And that, to me, as a historian, this is going back to the change over time. That's what's really interesting to me. Like, what did it mean to be indigenous? Of course, it shouldn't mean what it meant in the 14th century or in the 13th century, because they've evolved. So I think that's what I constantly am trying to, play with in my work.
In my experience, like archaeology and historian, also in the Caribbean region, I say like indigeneity is something very fluid, very, dynamic with agency. For example, when we analyze, when the Spaniards arrived to the Caribbean region, they homogenize all the people, all the indigenous people, the diversity that we have in the Caribbean at this moment in only one term, Indio. Indio was a form to, many people with a specific, and many indigenous people with a specific identity lost the identity, for colonial or under this colonial term. And also, like Dana mentioned, when after the encomienda system, for example, the indigenous people suffer transformation in identity. They start using clothes. They start, they lost something. They also continue on their dress. They lost many customs, but this transformation, this adaptation, this new form also was a form to connect with the indigenous identity. In that case, we can see, at the middle of the 16th century, we had some kind of transformation of this indigeneity and another form of connection with this kind of ancestor. And also in the case of the Caribbean, one of the most important, technique, weapons that the Spaniard colonialists used was to proclaim the extinction of indigenous people with many reasons: economical reason, political reason, social reason. The indigeneity in the case of the Caribbean is a complex issue because we have the trail of colonialism and also this idea of extinction. In the case, for example, Dominican Republic, indigeneity in some ways is sometimes used for avoid the black skin. And also in that case, the people use indigeneity more for racial differentiation, respect to the Haitian people. And also in the case of Cuba, for example, we have, this myth of extinction was, relevant in our historiography until the half of the 20th century. Now we have, in Puerto Rico, for example, in the case of Cuba, also in Dominican Republic, we have a revival of indigeneity, could be with another form or in another form, in another perspective. No, we're thinking in the indigeneity today, for example, in the Caribbean, basically in Puerto Rico, in political and social fighting, against the colonization. Also, you can see some people reclaim indigeneity more in the romantic vision, like a connection with the past, more some kind of romanticization. This is another form of indigeneity we have in the Caribbean, and also we have also indigeneity through the blood, to the DNA. We have, for example, many people in Puerto Rico, many people in Cuba and Dominican Republic. We have around more than 60% of DNA connected with indigenous people. And now we have, after the second half of 20th century, we have a new revival, a new perspective in indigeneity for academic issues, for scientific perspective, also for social perspective or socio-political perspective. I think the definition of the indigeneity is fluid, is difficult, is contextual, is temporal. It's not like something black and white.
Well, first of all, I'm very intrigued by the recent the spectrum of indigenous definitions that you just gave, and especially the romantic one. And it made me also think, from a Moroccan perspective, how the concept of indigenous, or in this case, Amazigh, which is like the native definition of North Africans, or in plural, Imazighen people of North Africa, is deployed from the Moroccan government. And then I was also thinking how it was deployed throughout the colonial period and also from the own local Amazigh communities. And it's funny because this romantic notion is really present nowadays, especially with the DNA tests also, and the sense of like reclaiming the origins and also when used in open discussions about the origin of the Moroccans vis-a-vis the Middle East. There's this interesting like rupture between now North Africa and the Middle East because of this notion of North Africa is Amazigh before it was Islamized, because of the Islamic wave of Islamization, and before that the Hellenic also presence of Greek and the West in general in North Africa. But also it's interesting how the local community, especially the Amazigh people, can also deploy this term in a radical fashion. And by radical, I mean being fanatic about it, and with a little bit of violence, tension sometimes, because of this frictions between the Moroccan government as a state, as an apparatus that's governed, and in comparison to the past, let's say, sad or bloody episode of revolt in North Morocco and the resistance of Moroccan government. So there is some episode of violence, like in the north, done by the king Hassan Thani or Hassan II during some times of revolt. So this concept of Tamzgha or indigenous North Morocco was very present and has a lot of rebellious aspect of like revolution against the system and against the state. And they keep using this tension to reclaim the Rif land or the Tamazgha land as a way of going back to the notions of the territory and the origin of North Africans. We are not Moroccans, we are not Spaniards, but we are separatists. So there is this tension of separation as well. And another just observation that I wanted to mention, it's also the strategic use of indigenous definitions by the Moroccan government, which to me is it's interesting because, in my opinion, Morocco now is playing the card of le Maroc pluriel, like plural Morocco, and it's also emphasizing the spectrum of Morocco as a azulejo or as a spectrum of zilij, Moroccan zilij, which is like parts of like mosaic. That's the society, the modern society, or the consciousness of the like the plural aspect of Morocco, and they are using also this indigenous component as a commercial way. And I see it as a similar card to U.S. diversity politics, and I see it also as a way to open to the new wave of globalization, because Morocco is also receiving the World Cup between Spain and Portugal. It's going to be fire. It's going to be very interesting. This trinity, I call it, and yeah. So there's this use of commercial image of Amazigh, and you can see in Morocco, like in official websites, you can see like signs in 3 languages, in the Tamzgha alphabet, in French and Arabic as well. And obviously, this commercial and strategic, it's not by chance, because Morocco itself as a government is trying to stay away from France influence, especially on the administrative aspects, because Morocco inherited a lot of French administration structure. So they are trying to build this independence and creating something new, which is it's exciting because you can see a lot of errors and a lot of experimentation. But I think it's a good way just to be more positive about it and create something new apart from the typical discourse of history. And I would love to get back to a lot of ideas later, but just for the sake of keeping it short.
Thanks so much for that, Omar. I don't ever think about the 20th century. As far as I'm concerned, the 20th century didn't happen. I start to get hives when I hit about 1800, and I find that whatever happened after that, I just don't understand. But I think one of the things that was coming up yesterday, and that is I think we're hinting at now, is what happens when you have populations who either migrated voluntarily and moved for a variety of reasons, or were subject to forced migration. And what does that do to connection to land, to space, and to place? Because so many contemporary definitions of indigeneity and you're absolutely right. There are so many, right? That it's kind of hard to just pin down and say this is what it is. But many of them are really kind of place rooted and community in place rooted. One of the things I see in some of my 16th and 17th century documents, because that's where I live, and the 20th century never happened, is Indigenous people insisting on their connections to place. So in 1550, I have a list of people who were interviewed very briefly by a visiting judge in Nata, which is in the Pacific coast of Panama. But they were insisting on their ties to places that were more than 1,000 miles away. One of them was addressed as Catalina India, this kind of category of Indio, which is very flattening. And she says, no, I'm Catalina Cumanagota, and I'm from the village of Guaramental, which I can place on what's now the coast of Venezuela. So she understood that when a Spanish judge and an escribano are calling her India, that they were deliberately taking her away from those connections. And she insisted in that moment that, no, I am Cumanagota, and I came from this place, Guaramental. And I see that in documents in Spanish archives, in French archives, in English archives, where Indigenous people are insisting on a sense of self that emphasizes community and place, even when they have been forcibly displaced. And I think that's really important for us to kind of consider when we're thinking about how people move in space and whether or not it's voluntary, the way that they maintain attachments to the place that they claim. And I do wonder, since it's now started to come up, what DNA testing does for this. And I am coming at this from a United States kind of experience where blood quantum has become highly controversial among tribal nations in the United States. And this kind of, if you have a percentage that's too small, then you are no longer. Where indigeneity then becomes tied explicitly to blood and not to all of the things that are also associated with indigeneity, a community, a group of kin, and a specific connection to place. And so I'm kind of wondering, now I'm talking about the 20th century, I'm wondering what this kind of scientific investigation in an attempt to be able to say, well, you are 72% indigenous or whatever that is, right? What that then does to other aspects of indigeneity that have to do with your kinship ties, the stories that you tell about the places where your community is rooted, and I think that that has to be part of any kind of conversation in which we're talking about what does indigeneity have to do with state power, and what happens when states intervene in indigenous communities in such a way that they find that they have to connect themselves to these modern scientific ideas of what indigeneity is in order to be recognized as indigenous. I don't want to say I have opinions on this. I obviously do, but I think that among people who identify as indigenous or who are identified by states as indigenous, where people stand on issues of blood quantum, it's controversial, and there isn't a single answer to that question.
Yes.
Oh, I wanted to thank you for raising the DNA issue, because it's for full disclosure, I work with geneticists. But I'm pessimistic about the use of genetics because I have 10% sub-Saharan African DNA, according to DNA test. But I don't feel connection because it's probably 1,000 years ago. But anyway, just a background. DNA testing is dependent on the statistical analysis that they use, and depending on what loci or locus they use. There are 6 billion base pairs of DNA. So you can we call it plug and play genetics. So we shouldn't really use that to look at genetics, even maybe population movement and relationships. But when it comes to identity, it's problematic. But with that said, going back to to place and indigeneity, I'm going to use two examples in the Philippines where you have two Creole cultures, Zamboanga, the Chavacano, and the Chavacano in Cavite. The Zamboanga Chavacano is based on the Visayan language. So the Spanish were never able to establish a permanent presence in Mindanao, but they brought their cooks, their servants from other places, and so they developed this culture that integrates all things Mindanao, southern Mindanao, and so they have their Creole, Spanish Creole language, but they're not considered indigenous. And then you have a Chavacano in Cavite, so just south of Manila, where the Spanish brought Indonesians from Ternate, and so there's another layer to that. And so this concept of indigeneity actually came up with my conversation with a colleague in the Philippines. That they argue that if you are a an immigrant, like, or someone from in the diaspora, you don't care that much with your ecology or with your environment because you're not from there. And so I disagreed because uh, if you're born there, you tend to establish your tie to the land. It doesn't mean that because your parents are from another place, you don't care for the land. And so I think that's another strand in this discussions. But later I'll ask about, and we'll can come back about. This. We tend to be antagonist to national projects, but in the end, we have to work with policymakers for empowerment because we can't just be resisting. We need to be accommodate some of the things that can work.
I want to say something about DNA, because of course DNA not determines you are indigenous or not. You know, it's your connection with your past, with your culture, with your root. But it's interesting, for example, in the case of the Caribbean, but DNA is used by many indigenous revival movement in the case of the Caribbean to proclaim the connection with the indigeneity. Is basically in Puerto Rico, for example, we have in the Western Puerto Rico, we have around 60% of present of indigenous DNA connected with the mothers. Basically women was important in the transmission of this kind of DNA, and also, and in a positive way, like many of these people, they are not conscious that they have this kind of DNA in the body. But at the same time, I saw in Dominican Republic people who have really a knowledge, who have really a cultural connection, or they have, or they practice, they prepare food. They have many popular cultural practice connected with indigeneity, and they are not conscious that this form to do came from indigenous people. And in that case, you have a colonial discourses. When you talk with these people, how you feel, how you see yourself. No, I'm Dominican, or I am a Criollo or something like that. But 80% of the activity that they develop in the countryside came from indigenous knowledge. And this is something that, in my impression, is connected with the Stephen Say, the discourse of coloniality in the education, the proclamation of, the extinction of the indigenous people. They are not conscious that, they are cultural connection with these through this practice.
I promise we are going to continue, but I promised yesterday that today's session will be more dynamic and interacting with the audience, and I don't want to betray what I said yesterday. So I'm going to open now, just like for questions and or comments from the floor. See if anybody wants to jump in. I mean, so far what I'm seeing that we're talking about indigeneity as something that it's talking about resistance yesterday, but also today. right? We're also talking about like the issue of mobility and how, despite mobility, people still retain that kind of attachment to communities and spaces and so far. I think women and DNA, right? But also women and culture. I think that's an important way in which like the indigenous cultures and identities were retained. But now I think we have somebody from.
Oh yeah, I am Puerto Rican, so what you're saying is really resonating with me because as a Puerto Rican, I grew up thinking I'm a mixture of Spanish, of African, and indigenous, and that's what I've been told since I was a little girl. But still, in the same thing, I've been told I'm part of that the indigenous are completely extinguished, even though we still do practices around them. It's like romanticized. Spanish singer made a song and he used the symbols of the indigenous. And it's very interesting because even though as a people we're still practicing them, we're told we're a mixture of everybody that has come. We still say no, the indigenous don't exist anymore. So how do you think studying that in those dynamic, how does they work that we still practices and they're still part of our culture, but every time we are asked about indigenous or how if they exist, we say no, they don't exist anymore.
I just want to say something from the historiographical point is that what happened was that there was this notion that native peoples had died off, right? And there was like decades and decades of if not hundreds of years of scholarship to that effect, right? And so there is, in a sense, part of what's being told here is that the scholarship hasn't been done, right, to recover some of these peoples and recover some of these connections. And that's been one of the really dramatic and wonderful changes that's happened. And I'm going to speak from a historian here. Is that people are going in and finding about places like Becky. Your work is Rebecca. Your work sounds so exciting because, sorry, I really shouldn't. And but like people, like I said, every time I started a project, people were like, "Well, you're never going to find Native peoples here." And so I think that historiographically, and it is harder to find these people because they're not readily apparent in the documentation and to find these connections. So I've seen more work come out on places in the Caribbean where no one had seen any signs of indigenous people and they would all, had died off. And so I think that academically, you're going to start to see more work, hard work, really hard work for people going in there and digging into these archives and finding people that is going to, give people that sense of that sense of extinction is going to be just harder and harder to. But gosh, when people get these ideas into their heads, it's really hard, right, to dismantle them. But I just want to say, for historiographically, that's part of what's going on, right? Is the people who have no historiography, and so I think that's going to change. But
I want to say something about that in the case of the Caribbean, because the Puerto Rican case is really interesting. In many Caribbean regions, many Caribbean islands, the idea of the creation of nation is on the base of three roots. Indians, or black and or Africans and European. But what is the emphasis? In the project of nation, or this kind of project of national, especially in the began in the 19th century, we suffer some kind of reductionism, and also this root and also African root in many Caribbean region is really dark. Only European root is distinguished, only celebrated. And when you see what is national heritage, for example, in many Caribbean islands, who these islands show like national heritage for the tourists? Colonial places. The majority of these places, colonial places, and in this case, also the visual landscape that you enjoy, the monuments in many of these islands, is basically connected with this only one route, because this kind of idea of tree root is, in my impression, is a form of reductionism, because also you have Chinese, you have people from Asia, you have people from different places in the Caribbean, you have people from India. This is really one of the problems that we have.
Yeah, I'll just continue what everyone's saying. Speaking as an archaeologist and pretending to be an historian. Uh, so the development or if you look at the development of studies on indigenous peoples, colonialism, we tend to start from, at least in archaeology, culture history, like describing what we see, describing the cultures, and then rupture, as Omar has mentioned earlier, that we tend to look at the differences. There's a break, so there's another culture more dominant. And then that discussion, that school of thought was replaced by resistance because we are seeing people fighting, or these groups fighting a more hegemonic culture, and then we realize that that's not true. That's not uh, applicable to everyone. So the next step is syncretism, that we see, like Catholic syncretism. But then with syncretism, we still favor the more dominant culture. And in the last 20 years, we see this new theoretical focus on hybridity, where we tend to look at indigenous peoples developing a sort of strategy to accommodate what's being imposed on them to be able to uh, maintain their culture. So that's why you're seeing this iconography in archaeological record or in art today, because that is a reflection of how our ancestors were able to negotiate their place in uh, uh, a marginal setting. So I think sync hybridity is mostly the new perspective in looking at this process.
I have two questions, so I'll just ask both and then whether they come up or not. But one was for Enrique when you talked about kind of patrilineal belonging, and that because you're the son of the father and the grandfather, I'm just wondering if you could explain or contextualize what happens then, or can it happen through a matrilineal line if it was your mother who was from Equatorial Guinea and not your father or grandfather? So I'm curious about that. And then I wanted to ask also about the question of kind of tradition as identity. You know, if there's still a practice of indigeneity, then where is the question of erasure versus presence in terms of that as a justification for presence, right? If we're still performing rituals, traditions, cuisine, language of an indigenous past, is that enough then to claim presence through practice? And so I was really interested in the question that you raised, because especially then going back to Becky's observation, what does it mean to claim that space and identity if there is or is not then a kind of paper proof for it? And so I felt like those were two questions that for me arose out of your comments.
Yes. Excellent question actually, because this is the issue of patrilineal descent and so on. Well, let me first say something about what we just discussed. I think I think one of the issues that we as researchers, I think we grapple with is the issue of education. How national curriculum, in particular, in the case of Jamaica, it's very interesting because the history of the Taino is widely taught. Maybe not in the best ways in many, and maybe this is one of the reasons why Jamaican students feel so kind of detached from it. But these national curriculums, they shape our understanding of the past, and I think there is a lot that we can perhaps do but our understanding is continuously changing, which is also problematic and so on. But yes, I think we also have to think of, we are researchers, but we also educators, and sometimes we don't translate very well the work that we do to the other levels of education. Perhaps that's something that we need to think more about it. Regarding this, it's a very interesting question that you asked, because it's sort of like in the case of so I'm a Fang person because I'm the child of a Fang man. So Fang is the our ethnic group. in Equatorial Guinea, in Gabon, also in Cameroon, although over there they're normally called Beti. But important thing about it is that Fang in the colonial days, and I will say in the post-colonial days, were depicted as the archetypical primitive African. Some of my colleagues in Spain would not like to hear this, but the truth is that in a way, their approach and their view of Fangness and Fang people still kind of like color by those kinds of colonial impressions of the Fang. And one of the things is like, okay, so they're extremely patriarchal, and it's like, and you can see this in this patrilineal descent. Actually, it's way more complicated. So if you think about my family's genealogy, so I am Zhang Vo, Zhang, the child of Mvo, and it goes Mvo Zhang Okenve mitui, etui nkulu obono, and it goes on and on. But Etwitwi and Obono, they are women. So there are women in the genealogy, and we know the story of how Etwitwi became part of the genealogy. She married a man from another clan, and at some point there was conflict, there was neglect, there was abuse, and her family decided just like go to the village where she married. Normally, when women married, they go to their they move to their husband villages. Unlike me, who moved to my wife's village in Jamaica, right? But so normally, yeah, it's part local. But what they did is that they went to her husband village, and they took her back along with her son. And as a result of that, once she was removed, then she was part of that genealogy. Normally, identity, and it ties with the issue of blood, because parenthood or fatherhood, rather, motherhood is never questioned. Fatherhood is an arrangement. If you pay Nswa is the bright wealth, then there is a formalization of marriage, and the children that you have then now are ascribed to the father's line, right? If there's no such arrangement, it means that those children continue belonging to the mother's line, and those instances happen, and in those instances they were reflected sometimes in the genealogy. So the funny thing that happens is that in my case, there was no bright wealth. My mother married my father, and there was no marriage birthwell exchange or anything like that. So formally, I shouldn't be belong to my father's line, right? But there's the manipulation again, right? So the families recognize, oh well, they're married in Spain. Of course, they don't do those things, so it's one of us. What happens with women? Women, for example, in this kind of like mixed situations, it is the same thing in a way. They manipulate it. So formally, okay, she's married, but at the same time, there was no bright wealth exchange. So the child, we recognize the child as one of as one of us, as following the maternal line. So these indigenous cultures are very flexible. And there's all kinds of nuance, and there's all kind of manipulation, and it's not so fixed as like sometimes in some ethnographies make it sound, and so on. So yeah, it's dynamic. I think it was dynamic back then. It's dynamic now. In some ways, sometimes that dynamism is undermined by new patriarchal values, but it's present.
I'm not going to respond to that, Jordana. I'm sorry. I'm going to actually kind of go back to what Angelique was talking about, because and I think this has to do with what you were just talking about, Enrique, and patrilines versus matrilines, and how those actually function. And the way the DNA tests work, of course, it traces mitochondrial DNA, which is from the mother's line. And the fact that we see so much, I'm just going to put this in air quotes, indigenous DNA that comes from matrilines is also part of the settler colonial / imperial process of deracination through sexual violence, right? So the way that indigenous identity is erased is through forced marriage, through rape, and so you have then the birth of children who are raised speaking Spanish, for example, but their mothers were native, and so in that DNA is the story of how settlers try to erase, to quote unquote exterminate indigenous people, and it's through sexual violence. And we see it scientifically in that mitochondrial DNA, right? But we see it also in the documents. I'm not sure to what extent that can be seen archaeologically, and maybe the archaeologists have some sense of that. But I think that this also comes perhaps to Jordana's question about practice, right? Because my sense of how this was is that many of these women, and there are plenty of cases of this from Boricen, from Quisqueya, from Cubao, right, from Cuba, from Hispaniola, from Puerto Rico, who are, the Spanish marry them because they assume that then that will allow them to have claims to land and power. And politically, that's not necessarily the case, right? But what I think is happening with some indigenous practice, right, is that these women then passed on to their daughters, who passed on to their daughters, practices that we can now identify as indigenous practices, but that were hidden and so were never understood that way. And this gets back to, I think, what Enrique was saying about education and how we teach and how we learn. And, you know, when we are able to identify practices as indigenous, being able to teach them that way is a means of reconnection and revitalization. Sorry, I'm just a Debbie Downer, but anybody who brings this up, eventually I'm going to start talking about sexual violence because it is so pervasive in the documentary record, and has to be, I think, raised as part of this.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very curious to understand more how common DNA is as a tool to determine indigeneity in the Caribbean. I know it's a more established route in the United States with Native Americans and so on. I wasn't sure to what extent it's a common tool used in the Caribbean. And then I guess my second question is, if it is being used more, to what end? What's the reason for this? Is it for some sort of state recognition? Is it more of a personal, quest to understand past or so on? And yeah, if you'll be able to
Well, many of the
comment on that.
social movements in the Caribbean, who reclaim indigeneity, especially in Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and now Cuba. Like I mentioned before, the colonial discourse was this complete extinction of of the indigenous people. And also in the recent times, especially in the case of Cuba, was more recent. In Puerto Rico, I think was a pioneer in this kind of analysis. The determination that the presence of indigenous DNA, basically for the modern line, what is the name? I remember the name of the DNA when there's a mother is yeah. Yes. Well, this proof or this test, or the result of this test, especially in the Western Puerto Rico and also now in Hispaniola and more recent in Cuba, the social movement use this, or many of the social movement in this city or in this island use this to proclaim the no extinction of indigeneity and the continuation of indigenous people to the present, to avoid or to face this kind of traditional narrative about the extinction. But it's more like not like person. It's more like a movement, more like a society, more like a group of people who really want to recognition of the presence of the indigeneity or the indigenous people in the present culture of that island. I don't think it could be some people reclaim that something like that, but it's more like a social movement. Yeah.
Yes, I want to take. Maybe we can continue with this, and I was thinking of Stephen mentioned something. Sometimes we have to accommodate, right? And I guess yes, we do, right? But obviously that is something that in the context of this type of oppressive domination and so on. And when it comes specifically to the issues of indigenous people's identities and their ability to preserve their own identity, uh, uh, it almost seems counterintuitive. But I want to bring Dana here because much of her work is about yes, people accommodating, finding spaces within the crevices of colonialism and so on. So I think it's important to discuss this as well, how accommodation still allows the continuity or the continuation of indigenous cultures, identities, and so on.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I basically heard this thread in everyone's talk yesterday, right? And I think, like, I don't want to get stuck on words like accommodation or hybridity, but I mean, I think for too long, accommodation really did mean like giving away everything or adopting wholesale the other culture. And that's why I like this. I like the term ethnogenesis because right it means the creation of a new people, new cultural people. And there's a fantastic article by Frank Solomon and Stuart Schwartz called New Peoples and New Kinds of Peoples, and they're basically talking about these ethnogenetic processes. And so I think that like once you start looking into really what's going on at the local level, you'll see that people adopted that. Yes, some things were forced upon them for sure, absolutely, but people adopted things that they saw as appropriate for them, things that thought they were going to advance them, things that they thought were going to improve their lives. And so one of the things that maybe we can talk about later is like the intermediaries that everybody, the quote unquote intermediaries between right peoples and the state that people are talking about, and then and then they shape them to meet their own practices, right, or to meet their own objectives. So this is why I think like the process of like this dynamic identities, fluid identities, like being selective, even if it's at the very, very minute, very local, but this had a really outsized and dramatic impact. And so I think that process, and I think that process is really, really prevalent in all these places that, we're talking about. So yeah, I think it's more about, I still just think accommodation, like, speaks too much to the loss of culture, right? To changing, to not being indigenous anymore. Whereas it just, to me, I see it as a selective adaptation, right, of other cultures, including like in the mining district, there were many people there from African and African descent. So there was those, culturation appropriations too, and then shaping them to meet their needs. So that's why I like this whole notion of ethnogenesis, of this dynamic process. Yeah.
I want to say something about accommodation because it's really interesting that you mentioned, very prevalent in many places. But in the case, for example, like archaeological remains, I saw, for example, how this process you can see through the materiality. For example, I show you yesterday in one of my presentation how, for example, indigenous people who live in, under colonial regime, especially in the miner camp in 16th century, they were obligated to not reproduce the indigenous motif in ceramic. And you can see how they try to select element to try to show, to try to display through the vessel. And also they maintain the technique. They maintain, they continue using the same raw material sources. And also we can see the same process, for example, in Havana. In Old Havana, in 18th century, 19th century, you can see indigenous people or indigenous descended people living there and also continue working in the same way. And you can see in the Old Havana, ceramic, indigenous material culture, present there because the indigenous people also use, for example, the problem that the colonial people have, in many places for the Spanish monopoly, and they use this element to try to reproduce or to produce or to adapt it, a reproduction of material culture according to the demand of the market. You can see how they adapted the ceramic and another thing to the demand of the market because the people need this kind of thing. And also they adapted to this. And you can see, and you recognize through the materiality, could be the form is like it's more like a colonial style, or they try to reproduce something according to the demand. But when you go in deep, you can see the technique. you can see the thing is continue indigenous.
Yeah, and I'll just also offer another example. Like in my first book, I worked on these indigenous communities that moved out of central and western Mexico and moved to these mining towns to work, and they lived in their own communities, and these were people who were used to having forms of governance. So they went and petitioned for these having their own town councils, their own local forms of governance. So they're selecting, right? They came from a tradition of governance, so why wouldn't they want to? So that's not really adaptation, right? They're adapting the Spanish style of governance because they have to, but the desire for governance is not, right? It's they had it before, and then they would rotate. Initially, they would rotate power between the four communities, which is what they would have done in a traditional indigenous city. They would have rotated between these kapuli, between these neighborhoods, and so they did that. So then they're performing, right? They're using the old style indigenous rotation. So to me, that seems less about accommodation, and it just seems like this is again new situation that becoming new peoples changing over time, right? But they're still very indigenous, right? It's just now I speak of this as like having layered identities, right? And I mean, I feel that way myself, right? I always tell people that, I identify as Mexican American. I identify as, especially now, Californian. I mean, like, yes, or the Mexicana when I'm in Europe. So people had layered identities, and I actually think that's going back to your point earlier, Rebecca. That is one of the things about the early modern people. They were inherently very local. Their identity was local, and it's the formation of nation states, and it's this unprecedented mobility that comes from colonial rule that is in trying to impose all these other identities and categories on people. And that's when people start needing to define themselves, right? Because Spaniards will do the same thing. They will identify from the city they're from. They're not saying I'm a Spaniard. They're saying I'm from Sevilla, I'm from Burgos, and they'll say that in the Americas. I'm from Lima, I'm from here. So I think that's why the conversation and identity becomes so different from the 16th century to now, right? Because now there's so many layered identities, and now there's so many states trying to get people actually to not identify on those local levels to unify the nation state or the nation project.
I don't know if we have any other question or comment from the floor. We can continue. We can go on and on. But I mean, in the meantime, I want to bring the discussion to something that was mentioned. I came across yesterday when we I think especially during Dana's presentation, focusing more on the distinct experience of indigenous women. Right. Rebecca also mentioned the issue of the presence of women and also the different ways in which like women um, um, suffer this type of new type of power that came along with colonization. And by the way, unfortunately, that kind of violence that you're talking about is still we see still similar examples of that kind of violence in areas of conflict, right? Like the type of violence against women and its distinct form. But I would like us to talk a little bit more about what is distinct about the experience of indigenous women, and because we're trying to understand their responses, but the responses obviously are determined or heavily influenced by how they perceive the actions of these colonial power or agents and so on. So obviously, I want to hear what Dana has to say because her paper yesterday focused very much on this. But also, I want to bring Omar back to this because in your initial ideas, in one of the papers that you share with us, you also focus on this depiction of Moroccan women, especially rural women, how they were depicted, and it was very interesting because that kind of like a depiction of these women as animals in a way um, um, it, it it had similar it had connections with how women were described in Equatorial Guinea as victims of male oppression. They were described as, oh yeah, they are the beast of burden and so on. And But anyway, those are depictions from the outside, but then there are their own experiences. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about how these actions of by these colonial powers are affecting indigenous women in the context of Morocco, and also their responses to it.
I appreciate the observation, Enrique. Yes, indeed. In my research, I focus on also the medical discourse of Spanish physicians when they visited Morocco during the 19th century and also years after. And there is like one common stereotype about Moroccan women, either Jewish, either Muslims, that is that she's subjugated, for example, right, to the male authority, and it's these kind of representations are also based on some Orientalist narratives that women are um, um, limited by the harem lifestyle and being a good that belongs to the Lord. So there's this kind of dynamics from Orientalism and this fantasy of the odalisque. And there's also this not only this fascination from romantic literary production, but also the desire, also the masculine desire of um, discovering and penetrating the private sphere of some Moroccan houses. That's also generated some of these narratives. So the desire of being inside the most private rooms in some Moroccan houses also contributed to this kind of narratives. And we see that indeed back in the 19th century, women didn't have the same opportunities of men and the participation in the social sphere, but there was this cultural sediment of how women were presented and also written about from this cultural and especially Turkish culture of women in the harem. And in terms of the rural areas, it's interesting because a lot of those chronicles, for example, who visited Morocco, they saw the Spanish, they saw the Moroccan women um, from a beast mode kind of filter because they were working so hard and they were like very busy with like rural like errands and hard work, so they saw it as a way of describing the Amazigh woman as la mora bestia, or the beast Moor, because of the constant exposure to heavy work and heavy lifting and heavy tasks. So there was this perception of like this physical effort and also a subjugation to the man or the husband, and to the extent that they ignored also some of the very active women, like Sayyid al-Hurra in Tetouan, who was also a leader, who was like part of an elite groups of society. So they didn't talk much about, you know, women who had like opportunities to be educated and to be also emancipated, but they focused more on these marginalized cases, and as a way also to justify also this colonial trope of the white man, or the man who's gonna save, right, the black skinned women. And we see this dynamic similar to Latin America, right, also like saving women, like the burden of the white man, but in a gendered manner between the two sexes. So, and therefore this narrative of colonialism also leverage this um, way of like, yes, the presence of the colonial troops in is not only to bring civilization, but also part of this enterprise is to save women and to help them emancipate and save them from the situation that they are having or they are suffering. But it's interesting because if we are talking about Tetwani women, for example, by chronicles like Nicas Yolanda, the one that I mentioned yesterday, the Spanish physicians, or other chronicles and journalists like Alarcon, they they spoke a lot about the women inside the houses as if they were dedicating their existence solely to make up and to embellish in their picture just for the sake of keeping their husband or their lord happy. So they relied too heavily on this aspect of just superficiality and the stereotype of just like, gaining weight and being just concerned about jewelry and other accessories. And it's interesting, they establish a contrast with the Christian women in a way that Christian women is in the apex of the hierarchy, and the Jewish women is in the middle, and the Muslim woman is in the down bottom. And it's interesting because the narrative and the justification is that Christianity emancipates women because it allows her to be a strong actor in the society and to participate because it's a Christian thing. While the Jewish women, although they are better than the Muslim women because they have these qualities and yada yada, but still they cannot be equal to Christian women. And it's interesting to see just how this hierarchy, based on religion and based on the potential of civilization that Christianity, on in this case, the colonial power brings to a certain region. And we can see also parallel, if we are talking about continuities, right? With Latin America, with the notion of uh, Hispano-tropicalism, right? And the African women in Equatorial Guinea, like they draw upon a lot of sexual notions of women being lascivious and being like drawn to high heats of the weather. And yes, there's always this tensions, right? Of being sexual, being um, in need of like being dominated, and who's gonna bring domination, or who's gonna control this chaos is the colonizer, right? And yeah, I would love to hear also more from your perspective about this topic.
Yeah, just very quickly about that, because women in Equatorial Guinea, there's a specific type of woman, or in the case of colonial Equatorial Guinea, is what the Spanish call meningas. The meningas were the women who happened to be like in relationships with white men and so on. Not in marriages because it wasn't legally possible, right? Many of these men also were married, by the way. So, I mean, back in Spain, obviously, in the 20th century, especially from the 1940s onwards, it's much easier to go back and forth. And some men that just go there and they enter into this relationship with, and they used to call them meningas. And some people thought that meninga means like a prostitute. Where this term comes from? Actually, meninga is a deformation of the term. Uh, well, no, in our case, mina or meninga, which is fang for woman. So it has no connotations of anything like that. But I mean, they use that term. They didn't want it to. I don't know why and how the fang word for woman was used to describe these specific women. They never used it to refer to all indigenous women, just the ones in this relationship with and actually, they were not even found because most of these women were coastal women from different ethnic groups that they didn't see as backward and primitive as they found from the inland and so on. So that it's something we can talk about it more. But
If you allow me briefly to
yeah.
contribute to your discussion about menina, there's something similar in Spanish language, which is
Mm.
fulana, and fulana is just someone as someone. Fulan is someone, and fulana is someone, female or
yeah.
masculine. In Arabic, it means someone, but in Spanish, it has this connotation of meninga. It has
Yeah.
the sexual connotation,
Yes,
right? As a fulana y
absolutely.
fulana.
Yeah. Mhm.
Also, early on, fulano means someone who it doesn't belong, like someone who is not known in the community. Well, right, because like they were very formal about who was a resident and who was an estante. An estante was someone who was like temporarily there, but a fulano was like, why are you know what I mean? This was someone who was not known to be in the city. Like it was just someone who was just hanging around, and it was considered like really shady, because it was this was an anonymous person. So it's really interesting that you say that.
I think you call that NPC, right?
And in the 16th century too, you come up with these documents where they were like Fulano Garcia, like what's his name Garcia? Like what was his? I don't remember Fulano. Sorry.
If you allow me to also contribute on this fulano and something like as someone who is outsider, and I'm thinking outsider of what? Of the tribe. And in my opinion, there is also this intrinsic pressure on the fulano or on the individual to belong to a tribe. And if the notion of being indigenous to that land will bring me peace by belonging to a certain group, I will also, based on pragmatism and need, I will also reivindicate my native roots. So these indigenous components can also be very flexible and pragmatic based on the social dynamics as well. I mean, if we are not talking about only the genetic aspect or the anthropologic component, but just from a social dynamic perspective, there is this tension on the tribe to belong, right? And sometimes we see these manifestations of indigenous pressure just to belong for the sake of belonging, right?
I can provide another perspective on the other end of the Pacific. Again, with Ifugao, because Ifugao women, at least before contemporary times, they're still very powerful, right? They make political decisions. They make decisions on agricultural cycles, what kinds of rice varieties to plant based on the previous year's uh, rainfall pattern. But it changed because they have access to education now. Have they will work somewhere else as school teachers, government. But that also drastically changed their position in the society. But at least with all of the ethnographic interviews that I have this very like, one of the ethnographic vignettes that I've got is this one old lady killed a Catholic priest because the Catholic priest broke a taboo. And so they still talk about her today. This is just like 3 generations ago. And so the when the Spanish were never able to establish a permanent presence in Fugao, but the Americans did, and that changed the way women were. That changed the status of women in Ifugao because men were sent to school and the women had to stay. And so within within a generation, everything changed. And so this is never mentioned uh, in school curricula, but this is still being discussed within community stories.
So, Rebecca, I just wanted to ask you about the women that you're seeing. And I was just wondering how many women you're seeing and if there's information on what are they doing and the kind of ethnic diversity you're seeing as well, because like I said, I'm really excited about your project. Not your project, your book.
It's a book. So it depends on when and where. But in the 16th century, it depends on where you are. If you're in the pearl fisheries along, so Cabo de la Vela, Cubagua, then the lists of people are going to be overwhelmingly male who are enslaved. If you are talking about some of the rancherias that are doing more kind of provisioning kind of stuff, then they're going to be much more female. And in terms of the work that they're doing, it can be kind of hard to say. It just depends on whether or not somebody thought to write it down. But it is apparent that the women were heavily involved in cassava production and in making hammocks, spinning cotton as a kind of export product kind of situation, growing tobacco, these kinds of things. And you see more of that after the collapse of the pearl fishery, where you see far fewer enslaved men and many more enslaved women. So, I mean, I can talk more about that, but I'm not sure it's of general interest.
Yes, I think this issue of mention women are also children. Your presentation yesterday discussed children, and we had mentioned earlier on. We talk about this mobility and the displacement, and I was very interested in that because it seems that in spite of being displaced, people still felt strongly attached to their communities, to the place where those communities were located. And I wonder how long for. Like, I mean, if we think in more contemporary terms, in my case, for example, the ability to sort of go back and forth, it also helps to retain that attachment. So in a sense, basically, so that is the place where I knew that I will go. I will go one day. In the case of my children, they haven't been there yet, but they know that they're gonna go there. So the presence is there. But I wonder in the early periods where is there an ability for people to move back to those communities, and in that sense, are they able to retain not just like an emotional attachment, but also like a more concrete attachment with those communities? And also I wonder, because you talk about children, of course, in the case of like grown-up people, women, it seems much easier to have that attachment. But those children, once they're displaced, right? I wonder what happens. What happens with the children being displaced in terms of like their sense of community and attachment to those communities?
Yeah, I'm afraid I could only answer the emotional part of your question, with generalities, or I'd need the seance ball. Um, yeah, I mean, the children aspect of this project in particular has been heartbreaking. So unless breastfeeding children were allowed to stay with their mothers when they were relocated, when their labor was sold and relocated, if not, any child over the age of 3 basically would be marched to Mexico City. They became immediate wards of the viceroy. They would be marched to Mexico City and distributed among Spanish families, and I think I mentioned yesterday, or among monasteries and convents. So monasteries and convents held the largest numbers of chichimecas in forced personal service. And they would be redistributed there amongst the viceroyalty. And I have not seen a document, and unfortunately, expressing these emotions, we can imagine what that is. I haven't seen a document with any of these children being returned to parents, being returned to their territorial homelands, nothing at all. So it was a permanent rupture, and it's one of the more tragic. I have a little granddaughter right now. She's going to turn 1 tomorrow, and I just can't imagine having her removed from her parents. So it's a really tragic story. The other thing that I was going to say too about that is I do think this is part of the reason why these people eventually agree to engage in these ceasefires and these permanent relocations. Because I argued yesterday that it was a war against indigenous women and children because Spanish soldiers and officials saw them as vulnerable targets. And for the North, I mean, this is also in North America, right? Susan Sleeper Smith has this great book about indigenous women being vulnerable targets in these wars. And I think that part of the reason that they surrender is because they do not want to have their children taken from them anymore. And there's actually an account of a rebellion that happens in one of these Spanish convents because the children were taken, and so they go and club the friars to death. So it's fraught with emotion, and everything that we can imagine, but to the point of like, do I see this as a form of social death for these children? Yeah, I do. I do want to just say one thing too about mobility. As women are moving throughout the all women, Spanish, indigenous, they're moving throughout the mining district as much as men are. I've seen it in the documentation. They know how to use the roads. Their labor is so important to these mining towns that some of these mining towns will basically collapse if they don't have the women there doing the work, the laundering, the cooking, the cleaning, being available for sexual services, forced, consensual, and sometimes it is consensual or otherwise. So like these mining societies will collapse without them. So that in terms of that, I really hadn't realized how much mobility women had until I started. I'm kind of doing a third book project, but you shouldn't because I haven't finished my second one. But I mean, it was the original dissertation project. But where it's amazing how much women are moving. But yeah, we really don't understand the trauma that children are experiencing, especially in the particular book that I'm writing now. Yeah.
I want to say something in the case of mobility, also my experience in the Caribbean cases. From an archaeological perspective, right now we have we determined that mobility was, relevant in all the Caribbean region, also in pre-colonial time. The people move from one island to the other. No, I don't say easy, but they have this kind of tradition to move from one side, from one island to the other one. Also, right now we are looking, or we are finding, for example, with a extraction analysis, we can see, for example, how some people from one island or from one place of the Caribbean is now die in another places, or is part of, so they are integrated in that community. In colonial times, I think in the mobility was also an important factor for resistance of indigenous people. Not only for high places or really inaccessible places, also after or in post-encomienda moments, especially in the Caribbean cases, you can see, for example, how the indigenous people, also group of family move for special places. Like these places, or many of these places, continue like some kind of important note of indigenous legacy, like Yateras or another places in the eastern part of Cuba. And also, I think one of the most important things what we need to work in the future is what is the role, or what was the role of the family network in this kind of mobility during the colonial period. Not only, of course, you mentioned another side of the coin, but how this family network was relevant, in the form of resistance of these people, also individual in some cases, or group of family in some cases, when they lost the territory, when they lost the land, sometimes they colonize in new places like a group of family, and also this node was a kind of attraction node for another people, like family or something. Yeah, the family network, I think, was relevant in this kind of mobility too.
Alejandra Dubkovsky has a really good line about this in her book about the Spanish missions in Florida, where she says that where indigenous women were safe and protected, indigenous communities were strong. And when English slave raids start emanating out of Carolina into these, they target women because they know that's what's going to cause these mission communities to collapse. And it's a really kind of stark reminder of how that works. I just wanted to talk about a woman named Juana, who was interviewed in 1570 as part of an investigation into illegal slaving. And they ask these kind of very Catholic questions, like, are you married? Do you want to be married? And she's like, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to first tell you about my daughter, Catalina. And this is, her father was this guy, and her father then took her to Hispaniola, and I've never seen her again. And then my son Baltorazico, and then my other son Andresico, and then my daughter Inés, who was taken to this other place, and her father was, and I've not seen her, and blah, 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 blah. And then that afternoon, they interview a woman named Inés, and she says, well, that's my mother, Juana. And you just have this kind of sudden moment that Juana had kept the names of her children and where they were as far as she was able to determine in her head. And this is what she chooses to tell the Spanish judges, even though they're not asking her that question. And it becomes very apparent that that was probably the first time that Juana had seen her daughter Inés in years. And it's just this kind of moment where you're like, oh my God. But it is the women, it's the mothers who are trying to keep these lineages together, who are trying to keep in their heads the kinship lines that bind people together. I don't know what happened after that. So, but it is, we're talking about modes of resistance. And I just see that kind of reinforcing constantly, this is who my community is, these are who my kin are, and this is who my family is. And I think that indigenous people by the late 16th century have an understanding that if they are narrating this in front of a guy who's scribbling away, that this is getting written down, it's getting recorded. And so that they're using both their kind of capacities for oral history and oral history making and storytelling, but they're also reinforcing that by utilizing the Spanish technologies of writing in order to make sure that that these lineages that are not forgotten. And I think it's just extraordinarily powerful. I don't know what to do with that except just to say that that's a thing.
Yes, I think what Rebecca just mentioned is, I think it's also a reminder that, as students, then researchers, academics, we train to, it's okay to do this kind of objective analysis of the sources and stuff like that. But really and truly, we have to be empathetic, right? Because it is the experience of people, of men and women, children, that we are looking at. And if you try to make sense of those experiences, their responses or lack thereof, you have to be empathetic, as difficult as it is, right? To do that. But
No, I think that's absolutely right. And Dana and I talked about this briefly over wine last night, the kinds of things that we encounter in the archive, and they weigh on you. And I think if they don't, then you're not doing it right. Because if you are not feeling in your body, I mean, I feel it sometimes as like a physical pressure in my chest, and then, you feel the kind of, the tears that want to come when you're reading these kinds of things. Like when I realized that Juana and Inés were seeing each other for the first time in like years, and I'm like, but I think if you're not responding emotionally to what you're reading and what you're coming to understand, then you're not doing it right. But it is a lot to sit with sometimes.
all right, so just final question briefly for everybody, and maybe what you have to say also will invite everybody here to maybe say something about it. But I just want us to finish with a brief answer to this final question that I had for you. So we're looking at indigeneity, and we obviously looking at it from the perspective of the experience of these peoples, communities, groups, men and women from Caribbean, mainland Americas to the Philippines, Guam, Morocco, Northern Africa, Equatorial Africa, Equatorial Guinea, and in much of what we're talking is responses to, reactions to, resistance in a way, right? And at the same time, we know, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why indigeneity is still so powerful, because it gives us that sense. It's almost a different paradigm. I believe, I don't know if this has something to do with what happened at the end of the 80s, early 90s, in terms of like maybe indigeneity is that kind of like there's hope to resist within different parameters, right? It's almost like something that gives us a clear sort of framework of to resist particular forms of unacceptable power, right? But from the perspective of indigenous people, maybe yesterday and today, can we understand indigeneity beyond the framework of marginalization, beyond the framework of disempowerment? Is there something else that that perhaps we need just to transcend that? Because in a way, that category is a category that is created by colonial rulers. Is a category for them to exercise their domination, and still. Just like with race, sometimes I wonder if there is a time when we need to move beyond, and some of these kind of signifiers that we attach to these specific categories. In this case, indigeneity and so on. So I think just to follow the reverse order from the beginning, we can start with Rebecca on that end, and then move towards Stephen.
When you were asking the question, Enrique, my thoughts immediately went to language, because this has been one of the things that indigenous people, especially in the United States, have really resented, which has been the loss of language. But I see the category of indigeneity and the communities that form around it, and that are defined by it and define themselves by it. I think they're seeing it as a sign of empowerment. How can we understand our past? How can we revitalize our languages? And when I first started looking at this, when I first started teaching Native history, 15 years ago, there were only a handful of these language revitalization projects. And now a good friend of mine who is a citizen of Choctaw Nation is doing it on Duolingo style on his phone to learn language. And so I think we're actually already doing that. And I think that indigenous people are already doing that, where they're just like, all right, what is it that we want and how are we going to make it happen? And in the US, at least, a lot of that has to do with language and language revitalization. For the first time, well, probably ever, indigenous languages are being increasingly taught at American universities. So you can learn Quechua here at NYU. You can learn Nahuatl and Mixtec at Lehman College in Queens. We're talking about a Cherokee language program through our site in Tulsa. And I'm just seeing a lot of this happening as indigenous people embracing indigeneity and what that might mean and using it to build their own thing. And to not be kind of concerned about is this disempowering us or are we marginalized? We're in our own community and we're going to do this. So I think maybe scholars kind of need to catch up with that in a way. Maybe that's what I would suggest in terms of the kinds of terminology and the meanings that get attached to indigenous. And so maybe we need to, as scholars, catch up and not necessarily be putting it in terms of marginalization. Did that make any sense? Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for the nod. I appreciate that.
I totally agree with you on the notion of the language. I think indeed the language has this aspect of convention, and that is connected to a society and how conventions are built. And there is this dimension of practicality of a notion, either it's a concept or tradition or anything related to a community. And language is powerful because it circulates and it makes a huge difference when it's affecting the daily practices of either an individual or a group. So I believe language is very powerful in this regard. And also to add that, to contribute to Beggie's point, is cultures as well. I see cultures is crucial in this role of using concept or identity markers like indigenous component, because I see some cultures are oriented toward the future, which means, in my opinion, they anticipate future changes and they take the lead on those conversation, on those strategies to leverage that discourse or the narrative before someone else or will do it for them. So I see it from this nature of a tribe or a culture taking more lead than other cultures who are like comfortable with returning back to past notions of indigenous definitions or what we found our parents doing, right? So there is this notion of every culture is different in this sense of how a culture is oriented vis-a-vis the future. And also this notion of pragmatic cold interest in terms of dealing with other nations or establishing a new tendency or una moda to sell something. Either it's a product or it's a new image or adapting to a new event, like I mentioned before. Either it's a World Cup or it's a feeling of a group of people. Like, for example, what happens, and I go back to the World Cup a lot, like Morocco when they played in Qatar. So a lot of Arab countries, they were cheering for Morocco as if Morocco was an Arab country. But we've seen a change of this discourse and also attitude toward Arabness that emanated from the people watching the soccer. And what I mentioned in this, it wasn't like a discourse pushed by academics or pushed from strategic institutions that push forward this narrative, but it was from people who are just interested in, common sport event. But the idea was like, we celebrate our win, but we are more Amazi or more indigenous, and we are not Arabs. So, and you could see like people holding like flags of the Tamazgha nation and talking about like we have to make a rupture with these Arab countries because we are not Arab anymore, and we have to be aware of like the Arab component of North Africa was because of the Islamic expansion and the liturgy that Islam brought with that is inherently Arabic. So there was this new waking up, a new consciousness that is emerging within the Moroccan national movement. And it's interesting because you see different registers: academic, folkloric, social, etc. So language for me is indeed important, the type of cultures and how a group of people is situated within the future. Does it have long-term orientation? Does it have more uncertainty, acceptance, or avoidance? These dynamics, in my opinion, will also establish a way of how we are creating new categories and new names and concepts concerning indigenous ideas.
Thank you. Like Enrique mentioned at the beginning of the panels, the coloniality had different or used different tools in different places, and also had the capacity to transform, adapt it, change it according to the answer of the people, according to the reply of the indigenous people. In my case, in my experience, from the Caribbean, when we talk about indigeneity, we need to think in how the indigenous people also try to reply of this, new form that the coloniality adopted in different places. For me, in the case of the Iceland, indigeneity is more like a connection or abandon of the discourse of victimization. We are victim of, we are extinct, we are disappeared. Is the abandon of this discourse of victimization to get more empowerment, to really say we are here, we are present. There is a form to reclaim indigenous recognition in the national identity, in the project of nation that the Caribbean, create after the independence. Also, is a form to historical recognition. When I say historical recognition, I say we are not only present through, traditional form that the folkloristic or romantic perspective about the indigenous people or indigenous that we have. We are present because we are, present in many ways, in different forms. We have the capacity to adapt it. We have the capacity to transform our life, our culture, but we are here. This is the reason the concept of endogenesis that you mentioned for us is relevant. And also all this process also have different, manifestation in different islands according to different colonial powers.
Briefly, I mean, when especially like I'll just speak about this like academically, this is the main question. The main question for the colonial ethnohistorian is how did native peoples respond to Spanish rule? And then what you move from there is this balance between exploitation and agency. So there it is a really tricky balance because you want to bring forth the exploitation, but you also want to bring forth this agency. And that's where you're moving beyond the framework of disempowerment and marginalization. And I think that's where the methodology of ethnohistory, of centering Native peoples and experiences, of trying to use documents that are written in Native languages, or in my case, when I don't have that, right, reading those documents, against the grain, across the grain, to really recover the history of Native peoples. And in doing so, it tells you an alternate history of the entire region, a place, an empire. So I think that's one of the ways to move beyond. And I think most ethnohistorians today are trying very hard to make that balance between exploitation and agency. And I just mentioned this yesterday. I mean, and I don't want to go back to the whole DNA thing, but there are people who are now finding out that they came from a particular part of Mexico where there were basically Chichimeca people there, right? And now they are writing to me and they're asking for articles and they're now petitioning for some form of recognition. So this was like I was explaining to Rebecca yesterday, like, and we don't know the origin of this, but like in the Caribbean, if you want to call someone a bad name today, you say, okay, eres Meco, eres Meca, right? So like the Chichimeca are like the lowest of the native peoples because they were the non-sedentary peoples. But now here you have people, right, taking, taking pride, wanting to recover this. So I think that really is always it's always there, the potential, but it's just that balance. It's that balance.
Thank you. The advantage of being the last one to speak is I can just say that they've already said what I'm going to say. But just echoing what's been said, there's this article that came out in the early 1980s, the pristine myth that indigenous peoples are, well, also exploiting the environment. They have the same wants and needs as us. So we have to, I guess, move beyond that marginalization and look at it in the same way how we look at ourselves. But of course, the varying degrees of exploitation, different values, for example. And so if we start to shift our at least a little bit our gaze into this issue, then we can document climate adaptation, food security, and so things that we'll learn from the values that peoples who look at the environment, probably the same way, but in again different wants and needs. So as an archaeologist, that's the direction that we're going on. We're pushing forward, working with climate scientists, working with uh, environmental historians, environmental humanities, and coming up with we ask the same questions, but we approach it in a different way. Um, I'm hopeful that we can have these intersections, but I guess this kind of gathering is a first step in changing the way how we silo ourselves in our own respective disciplines.
Yes, thank you all. I just want to, sorry, final word. Yeah. Yeah, no, I just want to end up with a reflection, something that Omar mentioned about future-oriented societies, because it reminded me of kind of something that we were thinking about, and I'm teaching and learning in this class this semester. And Sam, who is here, brought us. He's one of the students in the class. He share a reading with us, and was like it was fantastic because it showed in a contemporary setting, it showed how indigenous communities were sort of making provisions for to try to avoid certain situations in the future on the basis of their deep historical knowledge. In other words, like future oriented requires deep understanding of your past. And what I think we see in many of these indigenous societies, communities, is that they do have that deep understanding of the past in ways that non-indigenous societies oftentimes they lack, or their understanding is given through schools and so on. So we're going to end it here. Thank you so much to all of you for this fantastic discussion.